On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Yeo-Rumi and her boyfriend, Lee Ki-young, were seated at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Although they hadn't received their food yet, Yeo-Rumi was not focused on the menu. She was eagerly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a significant event for Yeo-Rumi because she had been dating Lee for several months and was deeply in love with him, but she hadn't introduced him to her parents yet. Lee had surprised her by making reservations for 4 people at the restaurant and inviting her parents. She was excited, confident that her parents would be impressed by him. Lee was a 32-year-old army veteran with fascinating stories from his military service. He was exceptionally handsome, well-educated, and came from a very successful and wealthy family. His grandfather owned the high-rise building where Lee lived. Despite his influential and powerful background, Lee was humble, kind, polite, and had a soft spot for animals, having adopted a dog and 3 cats. He seemed like the perfect guy any parent would be happy to see their daughter date. After a few minutes at the table, Yeo-Rumi saw her parents enter the restaurant. She stood up, waved at them, and directed them to the table Lee had reserved. They greeted Lee, who then ordered expensive drinks and meats. Soon, Lee was conversing with Yeo-Rumi's father about his military service and showing pictures of his pets to her mother. Yeo-Rumi enjoyed watching this interaction, as it was clear from her parents' expressions that they liked Lee. The evening went perfectly, with everyone enjoying drinks, food, and each other's company for about 2 hours. When her parents left, they hugged Lee, expressing their approval, and Lee reciprocated. It seemed like everyone had gotten along wonderfully. After her parents left, Yeo-Rumi and Lee also left the restaurant and headed towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. Yeo-Rumi noticed that Lee appeared quite drunk, something she hadn't realized earlier. Despite being impressed by how composed he had been with her parents, she felt it was unsafe for him to drive them home. When they reached Lee's car, Yeo-Rumi gently suggested they leave the car and take a taxi home for safety. Lee, however, took offense, feeling criticized for being too drunk. This led to a heated argument, ending with Lee abruptly ending their relationship and storming off to get a cab alone. Stunned and upset, Yeo-Rumi also hailed a cab and went home, crying herself to sleep. The next morning, Yeo-Rumi was surprised by a delivery of a huge bouquet of roses with a note from Lee, apologizing for the previous night and asking her to dinner that evening. Relieved and happy, she called Lee, forgave him, and they resumed their relationship. Lee continued to spoil Yeo-Rumi with fancy dinners, shopping trips, and luxurious hotel stays, trying to make up for the fight. Although Yeo-Rumi told him it was unnecessary, Lee insisted on continuing to pamper her, especially since it was the Christmas season. On Christmas Eve, Lee asked Yeo-Rumi to feed his pets the next morning as he would be out running errands for their special Christmas dinner. Yeo-Rumi agreed and arrived at his apartment around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day. As she approached the door, she smelled a strong scent of roses. Excited, she thought Lee had planned a surprise. However, upon entering, she found the apartment filled with wilted roses in dirty water, creating an eerie atmosphere. Feeling uneasy, she called out for Lee but received no response. She called his phone, but he didn't answer. Seeing the empty cat food bowls, Yeo-Rumi began searching the kitchen for more food but found none. She then checked a narrow hallway closet, struggling to open the door. Determined to feed the cats and leave, she yanked the door open, only to discover a dead body shoved inside. Realizing what she was seeing, Yeo-Rumi screamed in horror. It turned out that nearly everything Yeo-Rumi believed she knew about her boyfriend, Lee, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after their heated argument in the parking garage following dinner with Yeo-Rumi's parents, Lee had pretended to storm off to hail a cab. In reality, he waited for Yeo-Rumi to leave before returning to his parked car. He then drove home but crashed into a taxi. Although neither he nor the taxi driver was hurt and both cars were still drivable, Lee had a serious issue with drunk driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, Lee was imprisoned for drunk driving while serving in the military. After leaving the military, he was arrested for drunk driving again in 2018 and 2019. Even though the accident with the taxi driver was minor, Lee didn't want to report it to the police, fearing they would uncover his history of drunk driving and he'd get into serious trouble. He convinced the taxi driver to accept a private payment for the damages to avoid involving the authorities. However, the taxi driver demanded cash up front. Lee agreed and convinced the taxi driver to accompany him to his apartment to get the money. Once they arrived at Lee's apartment, a dispute arose over the amount Lee owed the taxi driver. The argument escalated, and Lee snapped, beating the taxi driver to death and shoving his body into a hallway closet. This was the body Yeo-Rumi discovered. After the murder, Lee stole the taxi driver's credit cards and cell phone, using the credit card to fund the lavish dinners, hotel stays, and gifts he showered on Yeo-Rumi over the next few days. He used the taxi driver's phone to send messages to the driver's family, pretending he was still alive. Lee also bought numerous bouquets of roses to mask the smell of the decaying body in his apartment. Lee's murder and drunk driving were not his only secrets. He had lied about coming from a wealthy, successful family that owned high-rises in South Korea. In reality, he had no money and borrowed from family and friends, fabricating stories about his wealth. When the police investigated the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment belonged to his ex-girlfriend, a bartender in her 50s. The 3 cats and dog Lee claimed to love were actually his ex-girlfriend's pets. As the investigation continued, police found traces of the ex-girlfriend's blood in the apartment and learned that Lee had murdered her, stolen her apartment, taken her pets, and used her phone to send messages to her family, pretending she was alive. Lee was arrested for 2 counts of murder and quickly confessed to killing the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, the police found the cell phone of a missing woman among Lee's belongings, making them suspect his involvement in her disappearance. Despite denying any involvement, the case remains unsolved. After Lee's arrest, the story took an even crazier turn. Lee became famous in South Korea for his exceptional good looks. News outlets played CCTV footage of Lee interacting with the taxi driver before the murder, and many women found him incredibly attractive, likening him to an actor, rather than focusing on his heinous crimes.